Good morning, everyone. So, today's presentation is about how good is good enough in psycholinguistics. The presenters are me, Cristiana Pasaribu, and my friend Dyah Retno Widyastuti. So, we've come to the first topic. So, in this chapter, we will comprehend about how to process the language, how people trying to process the language about what they hear or read as fully as possible, and how they get the information and interpret each word completely from the sentence. Suggestive evidence come from early 1980s and the Moses Illusion by Erickson and Matheson in 1981. This illusion centers on how people initially respond when asked to say whether certain sentences are true or false. The example from Erickson and Matheson is Moses put two of each sort of animal on the ark. Um, Most of people, when they hear this sentence, the previous sentence, say that it is right, but actually it is wrong sentences because for people who are fully familiar with the story, is not the Moses who put the animal but Noah. So how if the people who are fully familiar with this story or fail to notice the sentence? And then we've come to another example is after an air crash, where should the survivors be buried? Barton and Stanford in 1983 make a research that the finding is the half of the participants who were asked this question responded with an answer that indicate that they should be buried where their relative wish them to be buried. But actually, the participant failed to notice that the survivors in the sentence are living people. So, again, it's about people or they are not paying attention to all the details of the question. Another example of something less than full processing comes from the typical interpretation of sentences like no head injury is too trivial to be ignored. This is an example from Wesson and Range in 1979, and no knife is too small to be bent. By this example, we know that from the first example, this is usually interpreted to mean that even if a head injury seems very trivial, it should still be treated. And then for the second example is about no knife is too small to be bent. This is the opposite meaning from the first sentences, that using the opposite of the meaning, as can we see, to be ignored. Even a head injury seems very trivial, it should still be ignored. The first sentences actually doesn't make very much sense from a real world perspective, but if we ignore the particular grammatical details and interpret it to mean something sensible, so to be ignored, it use second part of verb is a verb too. So if we fail to this particular grammatical details, and then it becomes something sensible. uh, and then another material is about if there are times when people are not fully processing language, when are these times? So this chapter makes us think about this. So when else are people not fully processing languages? This is a question that this chapter will deal with. I hope along with this presentation you will get the answer. So there is a until recently it was taken as established and assumed by most theories of language processing that people process language as fully as possible in real time. The debate this is about um, what kind of information or cues get used during the processing. It's not about whether people are not actually processing the language fully. The debate is all about that. And then um, the conclusion that we can get from the debates is if it's really is the case that people are not always processing language fully, but rather relying on shallow processing strategies to create good enough representation. So if it's not about people are not actually processing the language fully, so it becomes people relying on shallow processing strategies to create a good enough representation of what they hear or they read. And then that's how language is processed in real time. Christiansen, Hollingworth, Halliwell, and Ferreira in 2001 addressed that readers fully interpret and thus completely repair the initial, and then incorrect synthetic representation to reflect the new, and the last is correct interpretation. Christiansen, Hollingworth, Halliwell, and Ferreira in 2001 make some sentences to be done in research. There are 3 sentences. The first one is GP is about garden path sentence. For garden path sentence plausible is while Bill hunted the deer, run into the woods. The second is garden path implausible is while Bill hunted the deer, pace in the zoo. And for non-garden path plausible is while Bill hunted the peasant, the deer ran into the woods. For the explanation, the initial misinterpretation, for example, that Bill hunted the deer, is compatible with the deer running into the woods, whereas in the impossible case is not compatible with the deer passing into the zoo. From that research, we know that this is the researcher want to make this as very specifically interest the researcher very specifically interest in whether they would get more incorrect responses from the participant. So they want to the researcher found that this was indeed the case. The participants were less accurate in the garden path sentence, and further, were less accurate when the ambiguous region was longer and the misinterpretation was plausible. The thing is the participant read the sentence fully with one go, read the sentence with one go, or read the sentence one by one word by one word. So the fact that for the findings, the researcher know that the participant is very confident with the answer. So why it happens? It may well be the case that people are scoring poorly, but know that they may well be wrong in many cases. So this pattern of result was found regardless of whether the participant read the whole sentences at once or word by word. Uh, the researcher then adding that perhaps they have an incorrect interpretation so often because they didn't actually ever get the right interpretation from the sentences. And then we come to the next topic is about reflexive absolute transitive or RAT verbs. So these verbs is special class of verbs that are well known to require a reflexive interpretation that there is no object given. So this verb is special class. So the sentences, if we put this verb, there we don't need object to, but we can interpret the sentences. For the example is hygiene, this is for personal hygiene such as wash, bath, shave, and dress. For the example of the sentence is Mary Beth. If we interpret the sentences, we know that without any object, we know that the object is a reflexive of herself, Mary. So Mary Beth means Mary Beth herself. If there is an object given, then the subject does the action of on the verb. But if we put an object in that sentence, for example, is Mary bathed the baby, means Mary didn't bathe herself but gave birth to a baby. It is clear enough. And then another topic is from the sentences in Christianson et al. In 2001. So they come with critical sentences that really ambiguous. The effect of that are striking as it is limited to complex or ambiguous sentences. It is possible that people may process less fully when in challenging linguistic environment. So what the meaning of by challenging linguistic environment is something like we change an active sentences to passive sentences. So how the sentence become challenging, we know for the example I put in here, this is the sentences in active and passive or hollows. As you can see in the sentences, for non-reversible plausible and non-reversible into implausible, it still makes sense, right? But if you see the irreversible plausible and reversible implausible, the dog bit the man, and for the plausible is the man was bitten by the dog. And then if you change it to reversible implausible, then the man bit the dog and the dog was bitten by the man. Uh, from that, we know that from a certain perspective, passive are more complicated than active sentences, and so perhaps it is the case that passive are more difficult simply because they are more complicated. As you can see in the previous sentences, the The researcher was particularly interested in whether people would be less accurate for relatively simple, unambiguous sentences that nonetheless had the order of the agent or patient reverse, such as dog and man. The changes from the agent and patient. And for the example, like the mouse ate the cheese, for the plausible one and become non-reversible, um, sentences were reversible but impossible if reversed, and sentences in which either referent could be agent or patient or theme, it means the sentence were reversible. I think that's enough that I can explain to you. The next material will be explained by my friend Dyah Retno Widyastuti. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Anna. I'll continue Anna's explanation. From Anna's explanation before, she was mentioned about the example of active and passive sentence, where usually passive are more complicated than active sentences. So passives were still responded to more slowly and less accurately. And we can find in our book that Ferreira argues that comprehenders do not necessarily fully process language as they encounter it, but instead rely on heuristic to provide a good enough representation. And here, the idea from Pereira, Bailey, and Ferraro in 2002 state that perhaps people only process language as fully as necessary for the needs of the current communicative situation. So, uh, it suggests that the degree to which people bother to process language fully uh, could be under strategic control. But it doesn't mean that we consciously decide to process or not process language fully, like that. And there are also some studies that support this idea. The first is like from Fraser and Reiner in 1990, and Friesen and Pickering in 1990, where stated that people may not select a particular sense of a word. And the second studies from Koch, Stanford, Clifton, and Dyah in 2008, and also from Poisio, Sturt, Arstein, and Philic in 2006, state that certain types of pronouns may not be fully interpreted if they do not need to be. And the next, using a change detection task from Sanford and Sturt in 2002, and the argument from Koch and friends in 2008, were stated that readers more frequently failed to notice the difference between two otherwise identical texts when a pronoun was changed, when that change didn't result in a contradictory meaning. So we look for the example. If two people go to a mall and they find a parking space, then it follows that each individual found a space. So from this example, usually the readers were less likely to notice a change when they found a parking space in the first version of the text. But there are some person that found a parking space in the second. Like this result suggests that readers fail to distinguish or to under-specify between whether an action was carried out by one individual on behalf of the group, or whether each member of the group performed the action in finding the parking space. And the next is hypotheses come from Sweats, Desmet, Clifton, and Ferreira in 2008. Further evidence in support of good enough, Sweat, Desmet, Clifton, and Ferreira in 2008 hypothesized by tested specifically whether task demands could influence depth of processing. They focused on a previous finding concerning the attachment of ambiguous clauses. So here the example. The first, the maid of the princess who stretched herself in public was terribly humiliated. And the second, the son of the princess who stretched himself in public was terribly humiliated. And the third one, the son of the princess who stretched herself in public was terribly humiliated. So we can see that from the first sentence, it's fully ambiguous with the respect to who did the stretching. It could be to the maid or the princess. But for the second and the third sentence example, uh, they're not ambiguous, but it showed that the reflective himself or herself could be interpreted as corresponding to either to maid or son and or to the princess. There are several studies have looked at the influence of particular synthetic forms on focusing attention. So here, how language might direct attention to particular information that is of interest. Birch and Garnsey in 1995 used two types of construction to focus attention: it cleft and their insertions. So for the example, for standard active, the sentence is the boy kissed the girl, and for it cleft, it was the boy with the underlined, who kissed the girl, and for their insertion, there was a boy. The word boy was underlined, and there was a boy who kissed a girl. So the standard active in here is just given for the comparison. And when read this example or this sentence, we can look that the key position was underlined, like the boy and a boy. So with this kind of contraction, it's easy to get the reader's attention to the text. And also from this example, it confirmed that readers consider the target word to be most important word in sentence more often when it was in one of these focusing position compared with when it was not. The participants were both faster and more accurate at recognizing a word. Next, in critical passage, the changed word was either in a clefted synthetic position or not. The changed word could also either be closely related to the original word, like for example, the changing word is related with the original word, like beer for beer and cider. And also for the unrelated, for example, like music for cider or music to cider. So we just look on this example, an example of a passive with the changed word in a clefted position with the changed word underlined. Everyone had a good time at the pub. A group of friends had met up there for a steak night. What Jimmy really liked was the cider, apparently. So we can see that when the changed word was semantically unrelated, the position of the word in the sentence made no difference. However, when the changed word was semantically related to the original word or the first word, then the participants were significantly more accurate at detecting the change when the word was in a clefted position. That and for the last in the last session in our book, we stated that from Modolo in 1988, he found that placing the incorrect information in a cleft caused people to catch the error more often. So it's like in making a sentence or making a paragraph, we have to avoid to put incorrect information in a cleft session because it can make the reader catch the error information from the text. And that's all from our presentation, and thanks for your attention. And if there's any question or suggestion or comments, please give to us. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.